Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist teaching at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Today, what I want to talk about is a general principle of scholarship that I think can often be forgotten by people who are first starting out to explore the topic of Norse mythology, a topic that I both have taught at several different universities over the past 11 years, and which I often present about on this channel. Norse mythology has become very popular in the last few years, especially with the success of shows like Vikings, with the success of the Marvel Comics movies about the Avengers, and etc. But, often today when we want to find more information about something, the first thing we do is we Google it, right? Or we go to Wikipedia or something. And while that can often give us a good idea about the very, very basics of a subject, it can do a poor job of actually showing us the genealogy of that information. And by genealogy of information, I mean, where is this information ultimately coming from? There are not that many sources that actually survive from the Middle Ages in Scandinavia that tell us about Norse mythology. And so anything that doesn't come from one of those sources ultimately is either a modern extrapolation or a modern interpretation, or sometimes just modern imagination. So this is something that I always have my students be very careful about in writing papers, right? Where is this information ultimately coming from? Can you trace it back to something that was written in Scandinavia in the Middle Ages? If not, it doesn't belong in serious research. It might be a valid interpretation, it might be a valid extrapolation, or potentially valid extrapolation, but that doesn't mean that it is fact drawn from our ultimate sources. Now, I've talked in many videos about what our ultimate sources are. The two most important are the two books called Edda, written in Iceland in the 1200s, the Poetic Edda, a compilation of poems, ultimately many of which are probably much older than the 1200s, and then Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. Well, those books, together with like Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, the Saga of the Volsungs, and some other mythical sagas like Hervarar Saga of Keithrax, form the foundations from which we need to be drawing what we're saying about Norse mythology. So if you are to look at, say, a modern secondary book, the big book of Norse mythology, or a website, the big website of Norse mythology or whatever. I don't want to name specific books because I'm not about trash slinging on this YouTube channel. And you go and you see something like Loki is a god of fire. That's a good example. Okay, it's easy to say something like that. And certainly that's a very popular notion. For instance, in Dungeons & Dragons, Loki is a god of fire. But let's go back to our original medieval sources and see if they ever say anything like that. Well, the short answer is that they don't. Loki is never identified with fire. The closest that we get to him really interacting with fire is that he has an eating contest against flame when he and Thor visit the court of Utgarda the Loki. Now, flame in Old Norse is Logi, and I can find articles as long ago as an 1899 article by Axel Koch in which it is mentioned that maybe Loki is related to the word Logi. And in fact, the idea is much older than the 19th century. But there's no particular scholarly reason to think that Loki and Logi are connected. The words rack and rag in English aren't connected, and they're as different as Loki and Logi are. Just because you have a K in one word and a G in the other doesn't mean they're connected. In fact, they're not very likely to be connected based on the way that Indo-European languages develop. Certainly you can get G's developing from K's, and that does happen in later Scandinavian languages, but you don't see that in Old Norse. So, but this notion that just because Loki looks like the word Logi, that Loki has something to do with fire, has become very popular, and I think it's partly fueled by this desire we have in modern times to say so-and-so is the god of such and such, so-and-so is the goddess of such and such, when in fact the Norse gods are much more personalities than they are roles, right? I mean, Njordr is much more of a personality than he ever is a god of the sea. Freyja is much more of a personality than she ever is a goddess of love. So I think and this starts with Snorri, right? I mean, Snorri to an extent is a secondary source. If you read the Prose Edda, he's interpreting many of the same poems we are, because he's quoting these poems from the Poetic Edda, or very obviously drawing his material from those poems. And sometimes what he adds to it isn't clearly actually part of an old tradition, but probably just something Snorri is interpreting. And then we can also see that Snorri has some clear biases, right? I mean, he's a medieval Christian. He wants things to make sense and be cohesive. And he also likes nice round numbers. He wants there to be 12 gods and 12 goddesses. And in making his list of 12 goddesses, he draws on what are almost certainly just alternative names of Freya or Frigg, names like Loven and Hlin. And he makes those separate goddesses, whereas they almost certainly never were. They're never referred to as such in any of the poems. So, we have to sort of trace back. Where's Snorri getting this, right? Even Snorri. Where is Saxo getting his information? How old is the poem in the Poetic Edda, right? Because there are some poems in the Poetic Edda that appear by linguistic analysis to be very old. Voluspa, Hovmal, Trimskila, Ríksula, for example, are almost certainly originally composed in the 900s. Some of the heroic poems, like Atlakvitha and Hamnismal, probably in the 800s, so even earlier. And then some of the heroic poems are certainly late. And so they're not going to be as valid. But then we have, as sources of what was actually believed during the Viking Age before the conversion to Christianity, and about the year 1000 in Iceland. But compare in skaldic poetry is so strict that any myth that is referred to in a skaldic poem that we can date to an exact range of years becomes that much more valid, because the skaldic poem referring to it, like a skaldic poem referring to Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent from the early 800s, that's a real example. That tells us that the myth of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent is that old. Even if something like Snorri telling us about that myth comes from the 1200s, we know Snorri is building on a real old source, right? And then also modern sources often mix sources from the Middle Ages in a way that doesn't suggest where their information is ultimately coming from. Ragnar Lothbrok has become a lot more popular lately because of the Viking show. And in that show, we meet both Åslaug and Lagertha. Well, they're never mentioned in the same source. Åslaug is mentioned in the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, which comes from Iceland and is written in Old Norse. Lagertha comes from Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes, which is written in Latin in the 1200s. And in fact, her name, Lagertha, isn't even an Old Norse name. It's a Latinized version of the Old Norse name Hlaðgerðr, which would certainly be what the woman was called in Old Norse. So sometimes I'll be talking about the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and someone will fault me and say, oh, you forgot about Lagertha, when in fact she's not even mentioned in that source. So, we have to be a little bit more careful and remember that nobody in the Middle Ages is working with an encyclopedia or Wikipedia or whatever, where they can look up all these details, right? They have a tradition that's been orally or perhaps to some degree passed down in written sources, and they're working with what they've got. And, today we can compare something written in Iceland with something from Denmark, but somebody in the Middle Ages couldn't, right? Or couldn't very easily at all. So I also think about the words of Ari Thorgilsson, the author of the first known book in Old Norse. Ari Fróði, he's often called, Arya the Wise. He wrote Íslendingabók probably in about 1122, and this is his very short history of the Icelanders. He's very careful to tell us that genealogy of his information. He'll say, so-and-so told me this. I was here at this time when he told me, and he is related to this person who was present when this event occurred. He's very careful to trace his information back and let us know what the primary sources are. And we need to do the same thing. We need to say, oh, not just I got this from the big website on Norse mythology, or from somebody who looks like a Viking on YouTube or whatever, but where is this coming from in a document that we can source to as close to the Viking Age as we can. And I pledge to do that in my translations and in my YouTube videos to try to make it clear what medieval sources I'm drawing from, when my own interpretations are coming in, and etc. And I will conclude this with some words from Arya the Wise himself in his Íslendingabók. Hvorki es misagt es I fröðum þessum, þó es skylt að hafa það heldur es sannara roynisk. Whatever is missaid in these teachings, then it is dutiful to have it rather, which proves truer. So, whatever I have missaid in my teachings or video presentations or translations, I would rather that you take whatever might prove truer from your own research into the primary sources. So, please do check out the primary sources. I recommend Anthony Falk's translation of the Prose Edda. I hope you'll check out my translation of the Poetic Edda, which aims to be more readable than any other that's available in English. I'm also translating the sagas 2 by 2. I published the Saga of the Volsungs, the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok this year, and I have another project forthcoming that I'll announce shortly. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.